Hi guys, welcome to Novum, and welcome to something I'm calling the Lightsaber Problem, which I promise isn't going to be a rant about Star Wars, except for when it is just that. It's actually a pretty major gripe I have with most mainstream action cinema that's become particularly noticeable over the last decade or two. Perhaps more accurately we can call it matching power sets, and at its most simple we can say it's the notion of the protagonist and antagonist possessing the exact same skill set, weaponry, or as is more often the case, superpower. Jedis fight evil Jedis, soldiers fight soldiers, wizards fight wizards, and so on. Now, at first this may sound like a sensible way of going about things, but to understand why it exists, we need to go back all the way to the start of the action genre. Because really, this all begins with the ideals of classical antiquity, from which we get our primary notions of heroism. Most notably, that masculine worth is proven in fair combat, a duel, a 1v1, whatever you want to call it, however it's put forward on screen. It's a very old storytelling trope where the main character has to fight someone with roughly the same skills to prove themselves dominant in fair combat. The reason this needs to be fair and equally matched is so it can serve as tacit proof that the differentiating factor between the opponents was the inherent goodness of the protagonist, that they are on the side of the right and the just. And this idea stems from the winner of combat and heroes in these stories being seen as being blessed by God, or rather, the gods. And this is perhaps most crystalline in my favourite action hero of all time, Achilles. Really the guy that started the whole thing off. He's unbested in single combat, specifically because he's favoured by some of the gods, and when he finally is brought down, it's from an arrow shot from Paris, while he wasn't expecting it, or while he was engaging in otherwise fair and honourable combat with other people. We recognise this as the bad guy winning, not just because we see Achilles as our hero, but also precisely because these rules of fair combat are broken. And just as a side note, not only do we see the archetype for masculine heroism here in Achilles, but we see another archetype in Paris, which is the more feminized but equally deadly dishonorable masculinity. You'll see this all the time, a more feminine opponent for the main character who has no care for playing by the rules or the etiquette of honor in combat. They're usually always sneaky. More often than not, there's allusions to them being sexually promiscuous or deviant in some way, just like we see in Paris, who started the war with his seduction of Helen. And this binary between heroic and unheroic, masculine and feminine, is at the heart of everything. Think about any time you've seen a character with a curved dagger on screen. I'd say there's an 80% chance they're also wearing heavy eye makeup and betraying the main character early on. The visual language is pretty clear. They're sneaky, they're dishonorable, they're unmasculine. I'll let you do the math on what the curve in the dagger represents, but again, we can see it as being directly tied to ideas of incorrect manhood, that they're not a straight shooter. Their use of makeup cements this, and we'll see it come out in the actions they're willing to take. Just like Paris, they may favour the use of poison, something that throughout history has been seen as traditionally a feminine way of killing somebody. It's unmanly to fight a 2v1. It's unmanly to betray your friends, to sneak up and slit someone's throat. Our heroes aren't bullies, our heroes aren't sneaky, but our villains can be all those things. And as a side note, this archetype is often very racially charged, to the point that it's sometimes referred to as the sneaky scimitar, in reference to how often these characters will be vaguely Middle Eastern and the prevalence of curved blades in their history. Now, while the idea of dishonourable masculinity is something that is absolutely a mainstay of the action genre thousands of years later, the notion of heroic masculinity, of brave Achilles and the glory and honour he fought for, that pretty much created the entire genre. The action hero is the one who stands against many, the one who holds the line while those around him falter and finds a way to win when all seems lost. And so when you need to create a villain for them to struggle against, more often than not, it's going to be a dark reflection of themselves. Someone equally matched in everything but morality. In doing so, you get the challenge required for the story to be exciting and the risk to be believable, and the ultimate positive messaging and catharsis for the audience that good wins in the end. And as we move away from antiquity, we see things like Arthurian myth borrowing heavily from these stories, not just likening themselves directly to the famous characters of antiquity, but also the notion that the heroes of these tales had the blessing of the Abrahamic God. Once again, they were on the side of the right and the just, and through the romanticized, if not historical importance put on the chivalric code, we see these ideas of honour and equal combat again playing a vital role. It's worth mentioning that this is by no means a European or Western only thing. These ideas were being championed in various cultures around the world, as they still are today, and we must recognise that a lot of this stems from something inherent within us that understands the notion of a fair fight, and how that would be a natural part of warrior cultures throughout history. You can very easily see how such cultures would want to decry treacherous behaviour as unmasculine because they favour strength hierarchy and martial prowess, and subsequently how these cultural ideas leaked into their heroic mythos. Now, if we fast forward to the modern era, this is really all we're seeing on screen. From the earliest examples of action cinema, knights have fought knights and cowboys have fought cowboys. And generally the thing that differentiated these enemies was their morals in a binary of good versus evil or dark versus light. The black knight versus the paragon of chivalry. The sheriff in the white hat versus the gunslinger in black that comes to town. And conflicts between these archetypes would always pay very close attention to their skill set, their abilities as a warrior. That's why we have these ridiculous tense standoffs where both men are waiting for the other to draw, or extended tournaments and duels where both men are allowed to display the limits of their martial prowess. Almost always, 99% of the time, it's a 1v1 contest. And traditionally, it's about showing that the difference between the two equally skilled opposites is the power of good. And while that's absolutely a mainstay of heroic storytelling, I don't think there's any doubt that in terms of action, in terms of the actual fights we're seeing on screen, it's got more than a little stale. And in fact, this isn't even the first time it's got a little stale. Because it's fair to say the Western genre was extremely popular in its day, enjoying a comparable level of the market to superhero movies currently. As such, filmmakers had to mess around with the recognised formulas in order to keep audiences interested. Films like The Wild Bunch and The Magnificent Seven played with ideas of contrasting power sets and asymmetrical action. Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy had great success using the concept of anti-heroes, choosing to focus on the flaws of every character rather than depicting them as paragons of virtue versus one-dimensional villains. This would be something that became intrinsic to the Clint Eastwood brand. Long before he was showering his neighbours with racial slurs in Gran Torino, his character in High Plains Drifter just fully rapes a woman for daring to speak out of turn to him, and that's the protagonist. But more crucially to this discussion, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly in particular pioneered, or rather adapted, the term Mexican standoff to bring an alternate and truly ridiculous dynamic to the traditional gunslinger standoff. Originally, the term meant simply to be robbed by a Mexican. Following that, the universal definition refers to a situation in which there is no clear opportunity for victory for every participant. But because of this matching power set issue and the inventive filmmaking of Sergio Leone, we now recognise it almost solely as 3 or 4 people aiming guns at each other. We also saw the Cowboys versus Indians trope, where the skilled gunslingers were pitched against a numerous and barbaric foe with more rudimentary technology. Again, it's this idea of asymmetry to the action that made those films so thrilling to watch, and maybe a pinch of nostalgia at the time for Manifest Destiny, leading to its success. And on the other side of the world, the same thing was happening. Swordplay and martial arts movies in China and Japan saw similar popularity to westerns, and indeed both genres shared a high level of influence over one another. And we see a similar thing with both hero and villain having the same power set and the general differentiator to victory being moral good. We also saw the same recognition that this formula would eventually get stale, and here more focus was put on the opposing martial arts styles, something that would become a mainstay of martial arts cinema. A great example of this is Seven Samurai, the film that influenced The Magnificent Seven, but it's so pervasive in the genre to this day, and it's easy to find examples of filmmakers taking steps to highlight what differentiates the opposing combatants.
If what you say is true, the Shaolin and the Wu-Tang could be dangerous.
Now, at the time, this was all very much a product of the genres. Samurais fought other samurais and cowboys fought other cowboys, and that's what audiences expected. Things were extremely restricted and effects were still very limited. But as action cinema moved on and left these genres behind, the issues of matching power sets persisted. Terminators fought other Terminators, Transformers fought Transformers. All but 2 of the vast number of Bond villains have been ex-spies or international criminals, essentially just dark mirror versions of Bond himself. As such, it almost always ends with a gunfight, then a fistfight, then Bond ultimately winning through an element of ingenuity or quick-thinking brutality. Casino Royale is the standout Bond film for me, far above all the others in quality, and it still suffers from this problem. Bond's enemy can parkour, so Bond can parkour. Bond's enemy can play cards, and so Bond can play cards, and so on. For me, it's always more interesting when the hero has to think their way around the villain's skill set, rather than simply butting heads with the same thing until the film decides it's time for them to win. Iron Man 1 is an incredible cinema-altering movie, but my one massive gripe is that he just has to fight a guy in a slightly worse Iron Man suit for the movie's climax. Sure, it shows that Tony's ingenuity and willingness to pursue danger separate him from imitators, but other than him flying up to freeze Obadiah, can you actually remember them fighting? Was there anything about that was engaging, or was it just two guys in CGI suits hitting each other in the sky? The entire tone of that movie, from Tony's "I am Iron Man" closing line to the whole criticism of the military-industrial complex, is building towards a very different kind of climax. But instead we get the most predictable third act ever, with big robots punching each other in the face, presumably because Disney thought that's what has to happen at this point in an action movie. Compare this to Tony fighting Whiplash in Iron Man 2, and I think it's easy to say which fight is more memorable, despite Iron Man 2 being widely regarded as the worst movie. It's because it's asymmetrical. Mickey Rourke has laser whips and a decidedly unarmored body, and Tony is caught entirely unawares, falling out of a crashed race car. And from that decision, we get a lot of development. We immediately recognize Whiplash as a brute that's obsessed with taking Tony down, with technology derived from the same ideas, but individual to him and his personality. He wants to publicly humiliate Tony, to ruin him, and the whip is this circus-style punishment he intends to put him through. For Tony, we see that he can still be heroic without the suit, that he's just as brave and just as reckless without it, and that his care for those people around him is genuine. We see him unprotected and at risk and still doing whatever he can to put himself between his loved ones and the coming threat. And most crucially, through his deployment of the suitcase suit, we see that his paranoia has been driving him to invent more and more contingencies, one of the main defining themes to his character arc throughout the Marvel films. And all of that extra development we get here stems from this decision to kick the film off with an asymmetrical fight scene, something built specifically around there being no matching power sets. And it's easily the most thrilling action sequence in the film, maybe even the entire Iron Man trilogy. And so finally getting back to the lightsaber problem, the issue of matching power sets is something that's come to define the Star Wars universe, which at this point is about as original and risk-taking as a YouTube essay about lightsabers. So many of the fights boil down to person with lightsaber versus person with lightsaber, which we can simplify to just a laser sword fight, and truly that may be what most fans want to see. But I always thought the most memorable opponents were Boba Fett and Darth Maul, because they did things that played with that formula. While we may get a fuzzy tingle when two lightsabers lock and make the noise we all want them to make, there's no doubt that the fight scenes themselves, for the most part, feel very stale. Now, that's not to say there aren't good fight scenes involving lightsabers, far from it. In fact, I think there are some really clear examples of great ones it's worth briefly looking at, so we can understand this issue a little better. Let's take my four favourites: Darth Maul versus Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, Vader's assault down the corridor in Rogue One, Rey and Kylo versus Snoke's guard, and of course, Obi-Wan versus Anakin on Mustafar, which I think should be considered the crown jewel of lightsaber fight choreography. I think in the Darth Maul fight, the asymmetry is pretty clear. It's a huge component of the scene. Darth Maul is outmatched 2-1, but he's clearly not scared. In fact, he's prepared, busting out the dual saber. And this asymmetry becomes the linchpin of the scene, with the laser gates dictating the participants of the fight and massively affecting the tension generated with each differing stage that the fight progresses into. It's precisely this factor that makes the scene so amazing and difficult to watch. Now, with Vader's corridor assault, again, we really couldn't get more asymmetrical. He's mowing down a whole unit of rebel soldiers who understand they have no hope of beating him. We get to see him at full brutality against a large number of enemies, and we see the enemies devise their own route to victory in the form of securing the Death Star plans. Even though we know the outcome going in, the scene remains thrilling because Vader is this unstoppable force tearing down everything in his way, and we're seeing how much the rebels have to lose for even a minor victory against him. He's undefeated in combat, but ultimately defeated in the scene, so here we even see asymmetry in the outcome. Really, why Rogue One is so popular was because it stepped away from this binary the series has relied upon of good wins, bad losers. With Rey and Kylo, I think the answer lies in the bold aesthetic choices going on in the fight scene. It looks absolutely stunning, but there's no doubt it is asymmetrical, as well as finding new and inventive ways to explore old action tropes. Watching Kylo and Rey learn to fight as a team, both sides of the Force fighting together, the unconventional weaponry of the guardsmen, them being outnumbered by skilled warriors, it's absolutely an asymmetrical or mismatched fight scene. And we get to see lightsabers used in ways we've always wanted to, but for whatever reason hadn't been on the screen up until that point. From force severing someone's torso with a telekinetic lightsaber to giving this guy the old light switch maneuver, this scene doesn't get enough credit for trying to push the level of quality in Star Wars action. And for the most part, I loathe what this film did to the series, but visually, I do think it's leagues ahead of all the others, and this far more stylized aesthetic does really help this scene land. And lastly, but most crucially, the finale to the Revenge of the Sith, because this is a straight 1v1 lightsaber fight, and it's incredible. For me, it's the exception that proves the rule. So what does it do differently? Well, for starters, its choreography is insane. The actors are stringing together hundreds upon hundreds of practiced motions, and it really shows on screen. The environment is dynamically used. At the time, the CGI was phenomenal, and I still think it holds up. But really, truthfully, what sticks in our minds is the back and forth between the two characters as they discuss their differences. While they may be almost perfectly matched in skill, the true battle is in their opposing views. This is not a good cowboy versus a bad cowboy, although it will soon become one. This is about trying to save someone you can't reach, and about losing yourself through fear, and all the things these characters are experiencing, culminating in this ultimate difference in views that they can't reconcile. And all of that is put across during the action. This is the apostrophizing of a Greek tragedy, where ill-fated characters go back and forth over their worldview. It's Shakespearean, and all of that is woven amidst the best fight choreography Lucasfilm has ever put on screen. If I had to say what this scene does differently to this scene, it's that the people making the film genuinely tried. So the problem is not that a good lightsaber fight is impossible to film. It's just that, for me at least, lightsaber v lightsaber is not some magic nostalgia formula to an immediately great action scene. In fact, despite that being pretty much how they're sold to us, I think it's actually an initial barrier in the way of creating one. Planning these scenes should always start with, okay, both guys have lightsabers, so what can we do to make this interesting? And that problem really is rooted in matching power sets. It's a fundamental handicap to putting action on screen that so many filmmakers seem to accept as a necessary part of the task. And so while I don't have any issues with lightsabers generally, I think the idea of a lightsaber fight is somehow defining of this issue. It's right there in the name, just like sword fight, just like gunfight. It's a fight between two people with the same weapon. And I'm not saying that can't be interesting, but I think it's time we started viewing it as a barrier to be navigated rather than some automatic win. Because if we make just one small change, literally the most basic in Universe 1 I can think of, like say one guy has a blaster and the other one still has a lightsaber. To me at least, the stakes seem suddenly much higher. Both of them have more reason to be terrified of the other one. In the sword fight, as the audience, we're going to blur over. No matter the fancy footwork or amount of blocks and parries, it's generally just a matter of waiting for the flurry to finish and the outcome to be decided by a shocked look on one character's face. They're rarely choreographed or edited clearly enough to actually track each movement. But with one having a blaster and the other a lightsaber, we watch everything far more closely. The fight is asymmetrical and both guys have clear advantages and disadvantages. As the audience, we understand their keys to victory. The blaster can hit from range, the lightsaber is deadly up close. The lightsaber can block the blaster, but a slight misswing can be fatal. Suddenly every strike matters, every jump cut feels like a shift in the power balance, and tension is generated automatically by clearly seeing the action rather than artificially by being presented with a light blur and good foleying. In MMA, there's a saying, styles make fights. Essentially that the secret to an entertaining fight is two guys having opposing or somehow complementary styles of fighting. And conversely, often the most boring fights are when two guys that have the same identical skill set cancel each other out. Really, I think we see the same thing on screen. We've just become so beholden to this stereotype that we've forgotten the alternatives. And that is by no means the bottom of the barrel, because the latest and most egregious trend in the matching power sets death knell is the CGI blur. Now there was a time post the first Avengers movie that every third act of an action film had to have a big pulsing laser or portal or death cloud in the sky during the third act. I will get a conspiracy label slapped on this video if I explain why, but let's just say it rhymes with Shmine Shmeleven. And if you want more information, I've done a documentary on it, link at the top of the screen. But in its place, over the last 5 to 7 years, it seems like the matching power set issue has given rise to a new demon, the CGI blur. And that's essentially where we just let our matching power sets do whatever they want in CGI land without ever worrying about context, logic, or what the audience can visually understand. Look at these frames from Venom v Carnage. What the f***ing fuck is going on here? It doesn't matter. Don't try and think about it. They have matching power sets. They can just fly at each other and goop out, and we can see enough CGI goop that our brain says, yes, that was a fight scene, so they can roll credits. Abomination versus the Hulk, the same thing. You can find it everywhere. The absolute worst of the worst for me is Guardians of the Galaxy 2, a trilogy defined by the main character being a human when it's funny, and an actual god being precisely and only at the moments it's useful. Unless the film is directed by the Russo brothers, in which case... I mean, just look at this. He can turn into fucking Pac-Man. They literally have the same power set just because the film wanted them to. Because then you don't have to write a compelling or unique fight scene. Just like Venom v Carnage or all the other examples, you just have the characters fly at each other and become CGI goop until the audience has seen enough goop and we can declare the good guy the winner. It's a strange trend we've moved towards, and I think the recent increase certainly stems from many of our on-screen heroes having clearly defined power sets, established villains, and supporting franchises. And so it's often difficult to put them in a situation where they're facing unique threats, where it feels like they'll fail or be challenged by anything but their identical twin. But I can't stress enough how much this shouldn't be the norm. The odds should always feel overwhelming. It should rarely ever feel even. When Rocky fights Ivan Drago, we know this guy has literally killed someone Rocky fought to a standstill. When Maximus fights the Emperor, he does so after being fatally stabbed. Every time Maximus goes out into the arena, it's a mismatch with a surprise challenge. If you want a memorable fight scene, stop making action films with heroes that can't lose, villains that are their clones, and stakes that are almost always even. And if you do have a seemingly invincible action hero, then you need to turn the heat and intensity of the fighting up so much that the audience can very easily forget. John Wick is essentially invincible, but when you send every assassin in the world after him, we're quickly back to it feeling overwhelming. Now, there are some standout cases of films doing the opposite, presenting asymmetrical action really well, even using it to drive the plot. A really clear one would be the Avengers properties, where we can see loads of examples of this. Obviously, they have a bit of a head start in that it's a franchise specifically concerned with this convergence of power sets, but nevertheless, they do it very well. Perhaps most notable is that despite them having saved the world multiple times, and all seemingly being unbeatable in their own right, Thanos literally obliterates half of them with a click of his fingers, and you really can't get any more asymmetrical than that. One of my favourite action scenes in recent cinema even is the opening fight for New York in Avengers Infinity War. It's a surprise attack with heroes we haven't seen work together before. We really get a feel for how their different powers match up cooperatively and against their new alien opponents. We get clear visual indication of all of their strengths and weaknesses. Cull Obsidian can easily launch Tony through a building, but the suit allows Tony to shake off the damage. Peter is much stronger than Tony. Stranger's cloak is entirely unaffected by the ship's tractor beam. Wong's portals can slice through Cull Obsidian with ease. Ebony Maw's alien telekinesis can easily overpower Strange. And the interactions between all these varying power sets are well thought through, visually clear, and ultimately entertaining. This is a constantly moving scene with absolutely no letup, and it achieves that with this mishmash collision of power sets providing dynamic moments that build up this action roller coaster. The airport scene in Civil War doesn't quite have the same momentum, but it's still incredibly thrilling because it's really the first time we get to see all these different superpowered skill sets face off with one another. Now, in your mind, compare that to Vision fighting other Vision, or Tony versus Obadiah. Obviously, one of those is a much bigger action scene, but the point remains the same. By contrasting the opponents, we've become entranced by the intricacies of the action. And by making them the same, we tend to blur out both visually and mentally. Another great example of a film doing this well comes from the heist scene in The Dark Knight. In fact, every single action scene in The Dark Knight. Really, the Joker in that movie, and the Joker in general, is the king of asymmetrical action. He doesn't have a power set beyond his warped mind, and subsequently has to navigate conflict via deviousness and brutality. He's always looking for that third way, for a Pyrrhic victory of sorts. This is reflected in every instance of action in the film being asymmetrical and imbalanced, and most importantly, completely engrossing, even when you're watching them for the 10th time. So, to quickly run through, we have a heist on a mob bank where the participants keep murdering each other, and by use of masks and context clues, encouraging us to try and keep track of who is who. We have Batman versus a whole SWAT team, a lone Joker against a room full of mob bosses and their henchmen, an unhinged Batman beating up a handcuffed Joker, Joker versus the Batmobile and Batman's moral ideology, and so on and so on. There isn't one fair fight in the whole movie. There isn't even any kind of real fight between Batman and Joker at the end, because that's not what's interesting about their dynamic. Everyone knows Batman wins the fist fight, and the movie doesn't dwell on it at all. Christopher Nolan's smart enough to know we don't need to see it. The action is thrilling and constantly keeps the viewer guessing while never having to resort to a third act slugfest between two dudes with the exact same skill set. There are tons more examples I could list. The lobby scene from The Matrix, really the whole first Matrix film in general, does it extremely well. Dread and The Raid take this idea of asymmetrical action to a ridiculous level by having essentially one or two very skilled combatants trapped in a way that harkens back to the Cowboys versus Indians movies of the Western genre. Gareth Evans, the guy behind the Raid films, is probably my favourite action director working today, and if you like his stuff, I would strongly suggest you check out the Bullet Farm episode from Gangs of London Season 1. And to come full circle, I think final proof of how misguided this matched power set trope is can be found all the way back at the start, back with Achilles. Because while the idea of proving masculine worth through even combat has pervaded world literature since men first pointed swords at one another, we don't just love Achilles because he beat Hector. For a lot of people, that may be where they start to see him in a negative light. We love Achilles because he kills everybody. Easily. He spirals his spear up and down the sands of Troy, making a mockery of all those that oppose him. When he fights, the Greek army wins. When he says no, the Greek army loses. It's one-sided, entirely asymmetrical. One man versus an army, sure, but the man has the god's favour and is the most skilled warrior the world has ever seen. It's the challenge he faces in himself and his desire for glory and legacy, and the grief he bears for the fallen that he's truly fighting against. In terms of how we portray our heroes, the Iliad is almost certainly the most influential text we've ever known, and even there we see this idea of asymmetrical action driving the stakes. The ultimate takeaway here shouldn't be just make every fight scene a 2v1 or a 30v1. It's that if you want to make a fight scene truly engaging, you have to find unique ways of presenting the stakes, of presenting risk in the action, and the one surefire way to kill that is just to do a cookie cutter, the hero fights a dark version of themselves with matching weaponry and powers third act fight scene. So filmmakers, please take note. St. George 1v1 the dragon, Oberyn momentarily bested the mountain. Matching power sets suck. And before I go, I just want to say thank you again for all your support. There's been another 10,000 subscribers since the last video, I think, and that's just astonishing to me. It's starting to look a lot like I can do this more often, and that's entirely down to you guys, so thank you. Sincerely, thank you. On that note, I'm very excited to announce that my novel is finished. At least I think it is. And I'm now in the process of sending it off to literary agents. And with that, I can also tell you work on the complete guide to Midsummer has begun. It's my hope that I'll be able to get out smaller videos like this one while I'm working on it. Lastly, to the people that have decided to support me on Patreon, thank you so much. There's nothing of merit there at the minute, but I am working on that too, and hopefully it will be shipshape before too long. And I think that's everything for now, so I'm going to go get back to work on Midsummer. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Peace.